Hello everybody and welcome to another video. This week we're going to be looking at making a shadow sword the best it can possibly be by covering it with tons and tons of stowage. Let's get kit bashing. So prior to the start of this video, I've built this shadow sword for a commission, but the brief of the commission was make it look lived in, make it look busy. And if you've watched this channel for any amount of time, you know that I love adding stowage to vehicles. I'm going to start by adding a few extra armor panels on both sides as they're available in the kit, and I thought it would make it look a little bit more unique. It's only a small detail, but I also added these wheels to make it look like there's a few spares hanging on the tank, and this thing is well looked after and maintained. As it's such a large vehicle, I wanted to add a few more comms arrays to the back, and I did that with what's provided in the kit. At the moment, we've not gone anywhere new. There's also an extra ladder in the kit because there was an extra sponson kit, as evidenced by the fact there's 4 sponsons. So I marked the ladder, cut it down to half, and made sure there was another access point for people to get further up onto the roof of the tank. Essentially, I'm starting with those things that would appear to be somewhat standard issue, and then we're going to start adding a ton of character shortly. The first thing that I'm doing to add a little bit of character that's not quite regulation is this big pallet of goods. You can get these from March of War along with these oil drums. I use them on basically every vehicle. I plan to build up one side of the back of the tank away from the ladders where everything is dumped on the outside. I imagine there's about 10-15 people sat inside the tank, especially if you think of all the different las cannon gunners and sponson gunners, so it's important that they have as much room as possible inside. One of the things I did to help give them a bit more storage is take this old Games Workshop box and shove a few bits inside it. The box itself is like a mini diorama, and it's always enjoyable to fill up things like this. To fill the box, I'm using bits from the Sentinel kit, bits from the Rogal Dawn kit, and a little hotshot las gun from the Tempestus Scions. There's also a little 3D printed jerry can that's also from March of War. I then super glued this, because the plastic's a little bit different to the grey plastic we're used to the top of the tank. The box looks a little bit like a jumble, and I wanted it to be that someone was rummaging through it as they went into combat. With that in mind, and more up-armouring and later additions to the tank, I wanted to add some sandbags all over the vehicle. I started up by protecting the ladder with some sandbags across the top, and then I thought it'd be nice to have a little string of easy to use, easy to reach equipment that anybody working on the back of the tank would be able to grab if they suddenly came under fire. Using a piece of very flexible wire that I got from a hobby shop ages ago, I bent a little rope looking thing and shaped it so it looked like it was hanging down slightly more in the centre. Then taking a few bits and pieces from the Cadian shock troops, both old and new, I started super gluing pouches and bits and pieces, mainly canteens and grenades, to this little rope. This is quite a bit of effort for what is essentially a very small area of the tank, but I think it really helps sell that it's a lived-in vehicle. I viewed this little space next to the second ladder with this kit stuff hanging next to it as an area the crew can go up, have access to the engine, access to their tools, and also grab all their personal effects from outside the tank that they couldn't fit inside. A tank this big isn't just going to be a vehicle of war, it's also going to be a home for the crew that live inside it, so it's important to make it look like it's actually lived in. With that in mind, I added a few ammo canisters around the sandbags at the top and a couple more bags to hang from the side of the vehicle. Up on top near the firing position I created for anyone crawling around on the hull during a firefight, I added a little las gun that's been strapped to the deck for anyone to easily reach. I also added a few more sandbags around the commander's cupola so they can stick their head up and have a quick look around with a little less chance of being shot by a sniper. A vehicle this large would need constant maintenance, even the small ones do, so there were toolkits added everywhere where I could fit them, including this little hammer that I attached next to the engine bay. It's not regulation, it'd normally be along the side, at least I think it would be anyway, but someone's moved it and welded it here so they can easily access it to bash the engine when it's not doing as it's told. I also had a fun idea of what to do with the shells that are included in the Baneblade kit, so I made these up as per the instructions and then decided to use them as empty shell casings. To do this, I held them down and cut off the active shell part, leaving just the brass below it. I couldn't grip it with my fingers, so I ended up using some pliers because they're so tiny they just wobble about when you're trying to saw them in half. Fighting vehicles are always ejecting brass, so I wanted to have these just to show that the tank's recently been in combat. After coring out the insides with a hobby knife to make it look like they're actually empty brass canisters, I wanted to use this little ejection port as the area where someone's chucking shells out the top. Modern military vehicles eject them automatically in a lot of cases, usually out the back, but I thought it'd be fun. 40k is a little bit backwards, so it's probably just some poor guy's job to chuck the brass out the top of this little hatch. Now moving back around the tank to add a few more bits of detail, I added some 3D printed bedroll to the side, or tarp or whatever, doesn't matter. And I also thought the commander could use one to pull over his head when it's raining if he's sticking his head out the top and wants to look around. I also added a couple more jerry cans here and there just to make it look like creative clutter. And then I took one of the really cool little boxes from the field ordnance battery kit and glued it to the front of the tank. I wanted this to look like it had slid down off of the side. Perhaps it's normally lashed there, but they've come into contact at a bad time and it's just fallen down next to the gun. Now that the main diorama on top of the tank is taking good shape, I wanted to add a few more details here and there, including these sandbags that are kind of piled up along the side of the tank that I sprayed liberally with activator, as I do everything. And then I wanted to add the lid of the box that's on top down the back, like it's been pulled off and chucked to one side. As they're trying to rummage through, they've come under fire and they've just left it there. A couple more sandbags on the left hand side, and I'm quite pleased with this solution I came up with. It was hanging over the end slightly, so I found this single sandbag and glued it underneath, and now it looks natural. Sometimes things just come together. They're only small details, but they're really fun. And with that, the kit bashing portion of this project is complete, and it's time to start painting and weathering. There's definitely more I could have added, logs hanging from the side for example and things like that, but I didn't want to overwhelm the model. And as it is, there's a few little moments and vignettes on top of the tank that the new owner will hopefully really enjoy. And with all that complete, it's now on to the painting. I started by using Colourforge's amazing Governor Green, which is essentially a colour match of Castellan Green, which otherwise would have to come through an airbrush, and I don't want to deal with that, especially not for something this big. The next thing I did was paint all the tracks in a brown paint. I started with Rhinox Hide and switched to Wildwood because it's faster, because it's a contrast paint. I then used my airbrush, very sparingly because I don't like using it that often anymore. I'm not very good with it, to give it a nice highlight. Also here's Arthur. He was hanging out, watching, having a good time. He's grown quite a lot. Probably not seen him for a while. Here he is, booping the camera, sniffing the tank. And of course biting me. Now I'm going to spare you a bunch of heartache, and you don't have to watch me base coating the entire tank. It's the same as base coating any other vehicle, just takes longer. I then varnished it with Colourforge's matte varnish, other options are available, and then used Tamiya black panel liner liberally all over those recesses. You can absolutely be neater with this and use spirits to clean it up afterwards, but I left this dirty because I thought it was a good look. And again, the brief was make it look lived in, make it look dirty, make it look busy, so dirty's good. With all of that panel lining now complete, it's time for a few transfers before we get into the really fun weathering. I'm using two transfer sheets. One is the Cerastus Night kit that has all these cool warning signs, and the other one is the standard Astra Militarum vehicle transfer set. I had free reign to do what I wanted with the transfers, so I just chose the ones I liked the best. This scythe with the kill markings seems to make sense, some kind of Reaper of Souls, especially with a gun that large. Whether you're using it as a Bane sword or a Shadow sword, it's going to cause some pain. I also added loads of warning markings and movement markings. The Cerastus Night kit has a bunch of arrows that point up and down, which I thought would look good on the turret. alongside a few more slightly ornate things because this is, gothic after all, but also those standard things where it says, don't stand in front of the gun, don't touch this hot part of the barrel. Or do, we don't really care, it's the 41st millennium. With the transfers on and sealed down again with another coat of varnish, it's time to do the weathering. I'm going to do multiple rounds of chipping here, starting with a dark brown in the form of Rhinox hide. This is really easy to do. You get a sponge, you dab a bit of paint on, you dab it off on a piece of tissue, and then with what's left, you dab all over the hard surfaces on your vehicle. I started with Rhinox hide, as mentioned, and then switched to Mournfang brown, or another equivalent, just some lighter brown, to chip further. These are some of your deepest chips, so it's important that these go on first, and then you can follow up with lighter chips. I also use these same colours to build up a rust patina on the tracks. That's the reason I painted them brown to begin with, and it's because tracks are always in contact with wet earth or horrible bits on the ground, and they're going to get rusty real quickly. Next up, our first highlight layer of chips is to use the same colour that I used through my airbrush, which is a slightly brighter green than the base colour, to add those chips on those hard areas, exactly where we've chipped that brown, and as we layer up, they'll start to merge together and look really nice. Afterwards, we can do the exact same thing with an even brighter highlight of green, just a little bit more sparingly on the sharpest areas, like around the skirt here, and on those sponsons at the end of the gun. There's a few more chipping stages to go, but it's just for those little hard pieces of stowage we've stuck on top, so some reds for the barrels, some light blues for the light blue bits. You know the drill. With most of the chipping done, it's time for a few highlights of the soft stowage. I'm using a bright grey here and a little bit of edge highlighting to make this tarpaulin look good, and I also do this over any of the weapons that I've painted black or the road wheels, just with a slightly more erratic effect to make it look like it's slightly chipped. I painted the box black too because I thought it would look good if it was a giant plastic box like the kind you'd get from like a storage company, and I don't know why that stuck with me, but it was a nice change in colour from all the green, red and blue. I also took this time to paint all the sandbags with desert sand over the Steel Legion drab that I'd base coated with. Then I added a bit of Ushabti bone as a highlight and washed everything with Seraphim Sepia a little bit later down the line. The wooden box had been painted with Steel Legion drab, and I now added a thin wash of Wildwood. Agrax Earthshade would also work here, any kind of brown wash just to make it look a little bit older. Another fun thing you can do that I didn't do here is then dry brush it with another colour, like a red, and you'll end up with what looks like a really chipped old red box. Quite a good look. Now we're back to the tracks and we're continuing with our chipping and build-up of rust patina using a slightly off red, Wild Rider red, which is kind of orangey and looks like a good rust colour, and using this a little bit more sparingly, but all over the tracks. Now onto the fun toys, we're going to use some enamel paints and build up loads of grease and streaks inside those recesses. Again, being slightly messy with this, knowing I can come back and clean it up later if I need to, but the brief was dirty, it's gonna be gross. I'm using this very liberally, building up into the corners of the top parts of the panels where rainwater's gathering around bolts and rivets and the like. and then dragging it down in a little streak. And we'll come back shortly with a dry brush and make sure that everything blends nicely. This is always a really satisfying part because the model is essentially done and you could have left it here. This is just adding more layers, more weathering, and more of a story to the vehicle, which is always really satisfying. And the fact you can stop at any time means that you feel like you've already achieved everything you need to. So this is just for fun. Now with a clean dry brush, I'm going to use a streaking motion to blend everything together. Enamels dry quite quickly, so this is easier to do with something like an oil paint, but I thought this was still quite a nice effect. It's important to only go up and down when you're doing vertical stripes like this, and don't go horizontally side to side because the effect wouldn't look realistic. Of course, if you're doing something like a flyer or a fast mover, then side to side is probably better because of the direction of travel. Whereas in this case, things are going to be falling down on this vehicle, not going backwards and forwards. It's probably not that quick. Now another enamel paint in the form of some rust effects. I'm going to be putting this all over those areas that probably don't see too much wear too often. So again, on those engine covers, on a few areas at the back with those exhausts where I don't think they'll be rubbed against things very often, so rust will form. And also over the barrels and oil drums and things at the back because they've probably been there a little while. I also applied this fairly liberally over the tracks and the running gear just to make it look like it's in use. Again, I left the running gear where it touches each other pretty clean because that's going to be worn down and rust won't have had a chance to form. Getting close to the end of the weathering stages now, and we're going to use Agaros Dunes and Wildwood contrast paints to add a few targeted streaks here and there. These ones are a little bit neater than the ones I did with the streaking grime, and they're a little bit more deliberate in their placement. I always find that the Wildwood looks particularly good on green paints, and it looks a lot darker than any of the other washes and things we've done before, so I quite like adding this in a few areas, sometimes inside the streak of Agaros Dunes I'd already done, and sometimes in whole new areas. It's entirely up to you what you do here. I added a few bits of heat bloom to those areas that are going to get hot, namely the exhausts at the back. It's a little bit cartoony, but I like the way it looks, and then added a little bit of soot at the end. And finally dry brushed the tracks with a nice bright metallic paint. I used silver from Vallejo, you can use whatever you like, but the metal's going to wear through when it touches hard objects like rocks and roads and the like, so it's important to show a little bit of metal. The absolute final step was to add a load of mud effects to the tracks and a few areas on top of the tank. Think about which way the tracks are going and use a crusty old brush or however you want to use it and stab it on. I always think about which direction the tank's going to be going. As it rolls forward, the mud's going to get thrown up to the underside of these barrels and near that ladder on the back, and the same on the other side, so I focused most of the mud there. I'm only using one layer of mud, but you can use some dry mud and then some wet mud like this, but it's entirely up to you. Depends what environment your tank is fighting in. You could also use some pigments here, but again, this is a muddy tank. I don't need the pigments for this specific one. Weathering a huge tank is always really fun, and I enjoyed doing this, especially as it was a commission and I didn't have to go out and buy the tank myself. I just got to do it for the sheer joy of weathering a huge tank. I hope this video was enjoyable and you learned something. As always, I've been Sam. See you next time.